This Transport Month feature is proudly brought to you by iFundi. iFundi, future ready.
And I'm sitting with the CEO of the Road Freight Association, Mr. Gavin Kelly. Mr. Kelly, thank you so much for making the time to be with us out here in Sandton. We're going to dive right into it since it is Transport Month. Give us a little bit of background about the history of the Road Freight Association.
Oh, good morning, Ruwazi. I think it's probably afternoon, so good afternoon. Thanks very much. The Road Freight Association's been around in its current form since about 1975. So 2 years from now, we have our 50th anniversary, if I count correctly. It was started in the very beginning by operators. Well, in those days, they were called transporters. What today is called an operator or a fleet operator, road freight operator. And that term is used because in the National Road Traffic Act, the membership that we have is referred to as an operator, as a fleet operator. Okay. So started in 1975 by a group of transporters who felt that they needed to lobby government and look after their industry. So this isn't something new. It's not something that's appeared just because there's been a change in the government in the country. In terms of a democratic government, there's always been issues that need to be addressed, and simple things like the condition of the roads, access to the roads, how competition should play between rail and road and air and sea, and all those sort of good things. It's a non-compulsory membership or a non-compulsory association, which is strange because around the world you'll find if you want to move goods in America or the UK, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, a lot of other countries, even Singapore, Japan, you have to belong to some sort of a trade association. You need to meet their requirements to get an operator's license. Let's use that term loosely because it's called something different around the world. And then once you're with an association, you can then move goods. In South Africa, it's voluntary, which has raised a couple of challenges and issues going forward, and we can talk about those later. So since 1975, voluntary, and it is comprised of various sizes of operators, transporters, as I said. We have various categories of those operators. We have what we call emerging operators, no vehicles. They just basically have a company, and we hold their hand and we take them along the route of actually understanding what they're letting themselves in for, what they're going to need to do in terms of standards, and what the pitfalls are in terms of operating a transport company. There are a lot of people out there who think, well, I'll buy a truck and I'm going to make millions. Well, as we always jokingly say, if you want to become a millionaire in transport, start off with $1 billion. Because there's so many costs and so many delays and so many other things that actually cost you money before you start making money. So we have the emerging operator, those who want to get into the industry. Then we have what we call owner drivers and micro operators. So literally, somebody who's got a single vehicle and does everything. He or she is the mechanic, the marketer, the driver, the packer, you name it. That's why it's called owner driver. And then we have the micro operators, 2 or more trucks, up to 5. And obviously, you can't drive all your trucks at once, hence micro. Then we have small, we have medium, large, extra large, and corporate. And the difference between the membership really is around the number of vehicles you have. Owner driver, 1 vehicle. Some of the corporates have 19,000 vehicles. Wow. Benefits, well, you all get the same benefits, which is important. But obviously, the different size of trucks or companies play different roles in the industry. So there's some very, very basic requirements that a startup company is going to have, whereas a large corporate company would have a lot more governance style issues, a lot more issues relating to a huge operation. So basic benefits, all the same. Doesn't matter whether you have 1 truck, in this case no truck, or 19,000, you get the basic benefits, but obviously there are areas of focus. It's a national association. We used to have offices all around the country, but since COVID, that's now digital. So the office is in your hand in the form of a cell phone. You can get to the association 24 hours a day and have comms 24 hours a day. Depending on what it is, the association will get back to you immediately or within 12 hours. So that's it really in a nutshell as to what the association is. Voluntary. It's not government related at all. There are a couple of people who see the acronym RFA and they think, well, it must be like the RAF or the CBRTA or the RTMC.
Yes.
Not at all. Absolutely private. We pride ourselves in negotiating and having what I think we like to say robust discussion and negotiations with government. We agree that there are going to be times we disagree, but we're not combative. We put forward why we disagree, if we disagree, and what we see as the proposed solutions would be. E-tolls is a very good example of that. So we say to government, whatever the matter might be, and I don't want to go down the whole e-tolls road, but just as an example, that these are what the challenges are, this is where it goes wrong in terms of fleet operators from our members' perspective, and here are some options or solutions, A, B, C, D, and E, and you're more than welcome to discuss them with us. So very much an interactive style with the various authorities.
Fantastic. Transport connects the economy. It is what actually drives different industries and economies. I'll start nationally. Looking at South Africa, what are some of the transformations or some of the big changes that the RFA has actually maybe witnessed over? I mean, it's almost a 50-year history that you've been in the game. What are some of the big changes or some of the highlights that you could name that your association has been involved in?
Well, that's a good question. I've been involved in transport for a fair number of years, but not all 50 years at the RFA. I think one of the biggest things that has happened, and I'm not going to look at it right now, I'm going to go back to let's go back to the 80s. So
Yes.
One of the very first things that has happened in terms of transport is the so-called deregulation of transport. A lot of people think, oh, that means there isn't any more government regulation. That's not the point. What happened in the 80s, and this is probably the very beginning of what we see in Transnet now. And a lot of people are very, very quick to point fingers at executives and whatever's happening in Transnet now. But this has been coming some time, and it has been or is similar all around the world. So in the 1980s, transport was deregulated. What that meant was the monopoly that in those days called Spoornet, or the South African Railways, today Transnet, had a monopoly on the movement of freight and passengers around the country. And at that stage, you needed a permit if you wanted to move goods or passengers, but we're talking about goods here, goods more than 250 kilometers. You had to go by train. And if there were certain reasons why it couldn't go by train, you had to motivate this and you'd get a permit. So in the 1980s, there was this, one can use the emotional term explosion, but there was definitely this growth in road transport. And that probably sowed the seeds of why Transnet today is struggling in terms of being an efficient, I'm not going to say reliable, let's just talk about efficient mode of transport. Because the building of sidings and the building of stations stopped. The main lines as we know them today and their sidings is what exists and has existed now from the 80s. So that was the first big change, was that there was this door opened to move road freight by road. And this was happening around the world. It's door to door. It's far quicker in many instances. You don't have to now fill up a train that's going to carry 300 tons or whatever the case may be. You could get a small truck to move a small amount of goods. You didn't have to get a whole wagon, which might have been 20 tons or 30 tons. So that's the first thing, and a lot of people have forgotten that. The second thing is that over that period, you have found that large companies have been created that look after the logistics chain for huge retailers or wholesalers. Okay. So in the very beginning, a transporter would have just taken your box of goods, loaded it at 121 De Korte Street in Johannesburg, taken it down to somewhere in eThekwini and offloaded it. Today, you find that many transporters, in actual fact, are more logistics providers and are what we call 4PLs or 5PLs. So they actually control the stock of their clients. They warehouse, they're far more into warehousing, stock management, and actually can distribute the stock across their clients where the stock is being sold. And a good example, I'm not sure if you're married, but I'm sure you would probably have the same experience as I've had, where you go into a shop and you want to buy a pair of shoes and they never have your size. Now, a couple of years ago, even if it was a chain store, and I'm not going to mention any because I don't want to point fingers at any store, you would ask, well, do you have a size 8, at the store down the road? And they say, well, we don't know. Whereas today, you can see your stock across the country. And I'm sure you might have experienced it, that they'll say to you, well, we can order it for you, pay for it, and we'll get it here in a couple of days' time. So that's the type of change that's happened, where transporters don't just move stock, they actually manage the stock. And they move stock to order to where it's being sold. So that's an important thing. Then in terms of technology on the vehicles and the size of the vehicles, they've also grown. So before 1980, you might have had 34, 36 tons in total, including the vehicle. That then moved up to 48, and we're now at 56. Because obviously, the more goods you can move per vehicle, the cheaper the transport, the ton per kilometer charge is going to be. It's economies of scale. So you can imagine if you moved one bottle of Coke or water or whatever, bottle of beer per truck, that might cost you, I'm just using round figures, 100 Rand. But if you could move 10, then it costs you 1 Rand for each bottle of whatever you're moving. And obviously that charge of transport gets directly passed on to the consumer. So we've seen economies of scale. We've seen new technology coming out in terms of the engines and how much power they give on the one hand, how much fuel they use on the other hand. And you can imagine, at 25 Rand a litre, that's a lot. When road transport first started out, it probably was 2 or 3 Rand a litre. Okay, inflation and what have you, it's not necessarily just 20 Rand cheaper, but it was cheaper. They were a lot thirstier engines then. Greenhouse gas emissions, so the engines have changed in terms of what sort of emissions they do, the type of damage that is done to the environment, the disposables, the waste. So there's lots of technology in terms of that. Safety, there are devices that help the driver remain focused, remain awake. One of our biggest challenges is a thing called fatigue, and that's difficult to identify, both the causes of fatigue and when it actually becomes an issue. So now there's technology that monitors the facial features of the driver, certain signs that show the driver's going to sleep, try to keep the driver awake, or at least interact with the centers that control the trucks and get the driver off to rest somewhere. So there's that sort of technology. Security technologies, tracking technologies. Now when you buy something, even if it's in China, you can actually track, where your parcel is and when it's due to get to you. So there's been lots of innovation in terms of efficiencies, which hopefully drive cost. And then there's this whole discussion around artificial intelligence, driverless trucks, and I use that in inverted commas, as you can see, because it's fine in an environment where everything is controlled, but where it's not, you can't just have a truck running around. But there's all this sort of development that's been happening. And in the last 10 years, there's been tremendous development, making trucks lighter, safer, tire technology that we didn't think we could ever have on trucks, 10, 15 years ago. Those sorts of things. So those probably are the highlights in terms of freight transport.
We've got a growing economy, one may say, but the population has definitely grown. What impact has the demographics and, let me say, the quality of our roads and maybe things like urbanization, what impact has that had on the freight and the road, specifically the road freight industry? And I think a lot about the N3 from Joburg to Durban. There's a lot of activity there, which obviously impacts the economy a lot, and trucks are at the core of that. And as South Africa has developed, what impact has that development within rural areas or the urban cities had on the road freight industry?
This is going to sound like a sauna. Well, Rosie, there's always a constant, and I'm sure you've seen the recent stats from Stats South Africa that the population has grown to, I think it's 65 million now. From what we last heard was about 51 or so. So that's a huge growth. So the first thing that is a constant is the growth in population. And I've always said to people, I think we're the new United States in the 21st century. So whereas the United States drew all of these immigrants into the US, South Africa's been doing that definitely since 94. And not just politically in terms of people returning, but in terms of being the land of milk and honey. And even though we have issues, we still have so much potential in South Africa. So the first thing definitely is growth. And there's growth in a number of issues. And one is consumer growth, the population growth. They are consumers. Secondly, it's infrastructure development. And then thirdly, it's business support. And road freight plays a huge role in getting goods to all of those markets. I mean, you can imagine consumer support. So have a look at the number of malls opening up in South Africa and the number of retail stores starting. So every single, and once again, I don't want to mention retailers, but you can think of your 4 or 5 big retailers. Every time a mall opens up and a retail store opens up, whether it's groceries, basics, or whether it's furniture, the goods have to get there somehow. The goods have to get there on time. And whether we like it or not, and one can have a discussion around it, rail isn't there. So you need to develop a road network so that freight vehicles can get there. And there's a lot of discussion around what sort of road network should you develop. So should we develop roads that will carry the very big heavy trucks? Or should we develop roads to take the medium trucks? And there's a lot of discussion around that. And you'll have some transporters who will say, we'd rather use medium trucks. They can make a better return on investment in terms of that. And others will say large trucks. Now, they're the very big trucks, the heavy goods vehicles. Now, there's a lot of discussion as to whether they should run between centres, and probably that's where they should run. Long distance, that's better for them. Larger volumes in terms of what's on the vehicle, and the smaller trucks move. So, definitely the growth has a huge impact on how we build our roads, where we build our roads, how we factor retail centres into that, how we look at flows of citizens around where they live, where they work, and where they purchase their goods. That's critically important. What is lagging, and a lot of people say, how does the Road Freight Association say this? What is lagging is rail in this. And we need to make sure that rail moves what it needs to move, and rail is a bulk transporter, so rail needs to play the role in terms of moving passengers to where they live, where they work, etc., etc. The second thing is that we can't continue just developing roads and pushing more vehicles into the system. There just isn't, the economy at this stage isn't strong enough to do that. A lot of vehicles are privately owned, so that's a private matter. But developing road networks requires some sort of infrastructure fund. And there's really only 3 areas you can get that financing from. It's either going to be privately driven, so when somebody develops an area, and you see that quite a bit happening, the developer has to develop the road network that supports either the residential area or the commercial or the retail area. The second is that the local municipality, authority, whatever it would be, develops it, but then has to go and find or refund that through municipal fees and what have you, and a tax. Call it what you want. And as soon as you mention that word, everyone's gone and got their pitchfork and whatever else is burning and wants to give us all a hiding. And then the third one is that it comes from a national funding perspective, and we've heard all of these discussions lately, and they get that money through bonds, or somebody like China comes and gives us a couple of $100 million. So that's always on the table for discussion. Now we need to look at the national routes that run, and you asked about the N3. The N3 corridor, which runs from a port, the port of Durban, at eThekwini, up through the center of the country, along the eastern side, but up through the center of the country, to Beit Bridge, and then into Africa. It is the busiest road corridor in Africa, not just in South Africa, in Africa. We know that every day, heading north and heading south, there are over 3,500 trucks per day. They don't all, and it's 3,500 going north, 3,500 going south. So there's a total of 7,000 trucks. They don't all go from Durban to Johannesburg. There's a lot of regional and local distribution that happens off that network as well. So some of these trucks are only 3.5 tons, others will be 56 tons or even larger depending on what they carry. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, is that this is a critical freight corridor. One of the questions is, there's a railway line running almost parallel to it for most of the way. Why isn't that railway line operating at the same level? A couple of years back, there were 10 to 15 trains a day on that railway line. Now there's 4 to 5 if we're lucky. So why isn't that picking up some of the load, as we say at the RFA? It needs to carry its load, carry its weight. It has. So apart from that, the N3 requires a fair amount of maintenance, development, rethinking in terms of where it runs. So there's a bit of discussion around the whole part through Van Reenen, which is a huge gradient for the trucks, both going up and going down. There's discussion whether we shouldn't bypass that and run the route, which will be slightly longer, but on a far more easy gradient for the vehicles. You'd have less accidents, you'd have less runaways, etc., etc. So there's a huge impact in terms of those corridors, and that has huge funding implications. The N3 is a concession, and that's one of the things I've said to the Minister of Transport. Concession the railway lines out, specific routes, get them working, get them privately operated. But the growth of freight, which I think was your very first question, has a huge impact, both on our roads, on how we develop the roads. And we must remember that road freight has taken over from where rail, and we didn't really have waterways in South Africa. That's very much an American, European, sort of UK thing. Sometime, somewhere along the line, road freight will be replaced by something else. I don't know what. It might be the Star Trek thing where you put something down here and you beam it over to somewhere. I don't know. You see a lot of changes happening in road freight in terms of electronic markets and how things are delivered. But it has a huge impact on the country. We require diesel to run our fleet. Diesel is in short supply in the world. We've seen what the increases have been in terms of fuel. So there's a huge amount of pressure in looking for alternative fuel sources, hydrogen, electric vehicles, multi-style fuel, hybrid type fuel things. So it has a huge impact on the country.
Wonderful. Just to
A feature proudly brought to you by Africa Nobuhle Creations, creating tomorrow.